Howdy, with this video I want to go over the literary fiction terms list. This is located in the content page under material for essay number 1. And the idea is that you got to use at least 5 of these terms within essay number 1. You don't have to define them within the essay, but you have to use them properly. And how you use them is kind of up to you. For example, if you're going to talk about the modernist, you may use a term like structure as one of your thesis points. How the essay structure is important to the modernist. To get that fragmented structure that you might see like in A Rose for Emily, where it's not chronological and it's all these fragments pulled together. Likewise, with the Hemingway short story, we move from external dialogue to narration to an internal kind of dialogue with the italicized portions. Very interesting structure, and modernists like to play with structure. For other choices, you may just end up using these as you go through, as you write the essay. Again, you don't have to define the term, just use it properly. And part of the point of this course is that you start to use some of these terms to discuss literature in an authoritative way. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Obviously, you're going to let me know if you need more clarification about any of these. Verbal ironies, when the words say one thing but mean another. If somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're like, hey, thanks, buddy. We need more drivers like you on the road. You're using verbal irony as sarcasm. But you also see it in literary works at the end of the story of An Hour, when the author says, she died of a love that kills. Chopin's using some verbal irony there. We know that Louise isn't dying because she was so in love with her husband. We know that she she was shot because her husband was still alive, and she loses the sense of freedom she had just developed. So the verbal irony can lead to dramatic irony like that. Another example of like dramatic irony is in Good Man's Hard to Find. It's ironic that the grandmother reads about the misfit at the beginning of the story, and then they all meet him at the end of towards the end of the story, and bad things happen. With ambivalence, generally wavering between two meanings. Right? If you eat that candy bar, it tastes good, but it's going to put some weight on you. So you're wavering between this choice between, do I want to feel good now and deal with the weight later, or do I want to just skip the pleasure and not gain the weight? In terms of literature, religious literature, Western religious literature at least, tends to deal with ambivalence, where your actions are either leading you towards the good place, heaven, or the bad place, hell. And what are your actions leading you towards? With the religious literature, generally that ambivalence gets resolved at the end of your life, right? Ambiguity, a little bit different. That's when you have 3 or more possible meanings within a work. Some authors do this deliberately. You see this in A Rose for Emily, when Faulkner is, by the end of the story, you're kind of like, well, what do you think about Emily? You kind of grossed out, obviously, when you first realize what the strand of hair signifies. But also you've seen what's produced Emily and all these things that have happened to her, and the townspeople's view of her and how they treat her, and all these different things. So you might feel a little sympathy for her, but she's stuck next to this decaying corpse. And she a hero, a victim, somebody with severe mental problems, which obviously is. Hopefully most of us aren't sleeping next to corpses, but but you get all this sense of ambiguity where you got these multiple reactions. Maybe you can resolve that ambiguity. Sometimes it gets a little more difficult depending on the story. So multiple meanings with ambiguity, maybe wavering between 2 possible meanings with ambivalence. Mood and atmosphere is just like what it sounds. What kind of atmosphere is being developed in the story? Rose for Emily develops this kind of gothic atmosphere when you get inside the house and the dust curls around them, and all these different descriptions of the bedroom and things like that. It kind of makes you feel a little creepy. And Hawthorne's kind of doing, not Hawthorne, Faulkner's doing that on purpose. Other works like the Sedaris work, it's kind of humorous, lighthearted, still getting to kind of some serious ideas. But a postmodern is going to have a much different kind of mood and atmosphere within the work sometimes than somebody like the modernist like Faulkner. Symbolisms, when an object or something represents something else. Universal symbol tends to cross cultures. A rising sun generally means rebirth, renewal, pretty much across cultures. It means the same thing here as it does kind of in Japan, the land of the rising sun, where they have the rising sun on their flag, right? And it's kind of a universal symbol that just transcends most cultures in the world. Conventional symbol is one that's unique to a kind of particular group or culture or belief system. Christian symbolism like the cross or the fish may not mean much in the middle of China to people who have not been introduced to those symbols and what they might mean to somebody else. A literary symbol, something that's specific to a literary work. Generally, a strand of iron gray hair is not symbolic of anything within our culture, but it means an awful lot in A Rose for Emily, right? And generally, some authors are going to try and really focus on those types of literary symbols and what they mean. If you get into the romantics, somebody like Hawthorne is going to take like the letter A in the Scarlet Letter and just deconstruct and just the whole book about the Scarlet Letter is about what the letter A means. Does it mean adultery or angel or it's just a fascinating examination of what one symbol can mean and how that meaning can change. It's also kind of important to note that the meaning of symbols aren't static. It's not like we all agree on what a symbol means. We're in the middle of a debate about what statues of Confederate soldiers and generals might mean, and who gets to interpret it and decide what that symbol means, and what we do if we don't like that symbol anymore. Same thing with the Confederate flag. Is it a symbol of racism? Is it something about history and things like that? We don't agree on what symbols always mean, and can create a lot of conflict within our culture, right? And authors are going to play with that sometimes, especially if they want to start using conventional symbols in different ways. Well, you can get in a lot of trouble as an author when you do that. And allegories, when the entire story is symbolic. An Aesop fable is a good example of an allegory. I don't know if we've read anything that's quite as allegorical as like the term might suggest. But sometimes Hawthorne short stories, you get to the end and all the symbolism is kind of representative of kind of a higher level story he's talking about, and there might be more meaning to the story than what you first see in terms of just the basic symbolism. The structure, talked about that a little bit with the modernists. How's the story structured? Is it chronological? Who's doing the narrating? How are we receiving information? Like with the Rose for Emily, it's just it's just pulling these different fragments of Emily's life in. We're not getting it in chronological order. We have to assemble the story in our own heads a little bit as we're, especially when we get to the end and kind of figure out what happened there. And oh, that's where the arsenic went. Oh, that's where. Oh, ew. Right? Modernists like to play with the structure of stories to kind of create that cubist effect, but also to create additional effects as well. And that might, like I said, that might be one of the, if you're getting into the modernists a little bit, that might be one of the major talking points, one of your thesis statements. Thesis points, not statements. Foreshadowing is hints of what's to come. Quite often, authors drop hints of what's about to happen. If you go back and reread A Good Man is Hard to Find, you'll notice the family passes a graveyard with 5 or 6 graves in it. They're coming out of the town of Toomsboro. The misfit pulls up in a hearse-like vehicle. All this foreshadowing of what's going to happen to the family at the end of the story. So that's not just a total shock. Somewhere in our subconscious, we picked up on these clues, and by the end, we kind of like, oh, we're shocked by the ending, but not. It's just not coming out of nowhere, right? Plot. That's just what happens in the story. This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. When I tell you to avoid plot summary, don't just tell me what happens in the story. I've read the story. I know the plot. What I'm generally asking you to do is talk about themes, what the story really means, what kind of ideas are being developed within the story. Something like A Good Man's Hard to Find. You see some Christian things being developed. What's the grandmother do at the end when she reaches out and touches the misfit and recognizes his humanity? It's not just basically what happens in the story, but O'Connor's developing this question of is the misfit being given this proof of God that he's been almost literally crying about and being angry about. He gets it and he rejects it. And different themes when we get into African American authors with the first essay. What kind of themes are they developing about race and how that functions within our culture? So themes kind of like, what's the story really mean? That's the dreaded question. literature students hate to receive. Protagonist is the main character in the story. The antagonist is the character that's set against them or working against them. So for something like A Good Man's Hard to Find, probably the grandmother's the protagonist. We're the one. She's the one we're with the most. She's the only one left alive at the end. So besides the misfit and his gang there. So she's probably the protagonist in the story, the main character. The antagonist is probably the misfit, who's kind of set against her, both theologically and physically. I mean, there's nothing, you can't get more antagonistic than shooting someone in the chest 3 times, right? Other short stories that might be a little harder to figure out. Emily's obviously the protagonist in The Rose for Emily, but who's the antagonist? Is it just all these pressures in her life? Is it the town? Is there one particular character who's set against her? It's a little more ambiguous, right? And Faulkner, again, that's that word, ambiguity. Faulkner loves to develop that ambiguity within his works. Static or flat characters tend to be stereotypical. One of the questions we had with Good Man's Hard to Find is how stereotypical is the family. How hard does O'Connor have to work to not get you too attached to him, because she's going to kill him at the end. So you can't get too attached to them, or you'll be so focused on their deaths that you don't pay attention to what's going on with the grandmother and the misfit. And some of you in your commentary kind of said, "Well, I got too attached to the family, and then the whole story is very disturbing to me." And really, it's a common reaction to that short story. Dynamic or round characters, one that gets developed. Character who goes through changes. You understand what the character's doing. The grandmother, and A Good Man's Hard to Find is a good example of a kind of a dynamic character. We kind of see her as this strange, kind of racist, mouthy old lady, but at the end she's the only one that's really able to make the correct gesture towards the misfit, who's able to give him that message, even if he does reject it. So there's something about her that the other characters don't seem to have. Same thing with somebody like Louise Mallard. We kind of see her at the beginning of this grieving widow, so to speak, but she kind of goes through this changes. Then all of a sudden, boom, her husband comes to the door and she falls over dead. We've kind of been with her a little bit. It's kind of a very short story. It's hard for Chopin to fully develop the character, but we kind of start to identify with her and see what she's talking about and what happens at the end. So kind of an interesting question there. Sympathetic characters, one you tend to identify with and feel for. That depends on the reader quite often. Some people just get to the end of A Rose for Emily and say, "I hate this character. She's gross." Others are like, "Well, I kind of see where she's coming from and what happened, and I feel a little sympathy for her." And maybe you even feel some of those forces working in your own life, or how many of your own decisions are really yours, and how much do you have to function within your culture and things like that. So that's kind of up to the reader quite often. Point of view, who's telling the story? How are we getting information? If we have a first-person narrator, that's generally somebody's using the word I. Sometimes authors are going to play with that quite a bit. In A Rose for Emily, we kind of have this first-person we telling the story. We're not sure who we are. Is it the entire town kind of telling the story? Is it one person telling the story? Somebody suggested in your commentary that maybe it's Toby telling the story. Faulkner creates that kind of ambiguity within his work. How much is the narrator a participant within the story? If you ever read a Poe short story, sometimes the narrator is actively involved in what's happening, like in A Cask of Amontillado. The narrators, we have a first-person narrator, I, discussing how he's about to bury someone in the catacombs. And also, not only is he a participant, but we kind of get this question of whether the narrator is reliable. Poe narrators are often insane, doing extremely violent acts. Likewise, within A Rose for Emily, is the first person we reliable? Can we rely on the townspeople not to gossip about Emily? How much of the information is 100% factual? Other first-person narrators can be fairly reliable and just kind of giving you the story. It's kind of an interesting question when you get into some of this, and what's the author's intent. Third-person narrator. That's he, they. They did this, he did this. The narrator is telling somebody else's story. Again, you start getting into this question of, is the narrator reliable? Does the narrator pull back sometimes? How omniscient is the narrator? how much does the narrator actually know? Sometimes a third-person narrator will just kind of, it's kind of like a science experiment, and the narrator's just telling you what's happening in front of you. Other times, the narrator kind of knows things that might be inside the characters' heads. We might know what certain characters are thinking, but not what others are thinking. Can be kind of interesting. So the narration, the point of view of the stories being told from, can be a very interesting thing to get into. Setting, where's the story taking place? With the Hemingway short story, that's one of the options for essay number 1. Some of the setting takes place in Africa. They're on safari. But then all of a sudden we get into italicized portions where the action's taking place in someone's head. And what the main character's head, the protagonist's head. And it's very jarring when you're reading. It's like, what's happening here? All of a sudden we're in a different place, and we're inside his head. We're going through some of his memories. Very fascinating, one form of narration, but two, also you start getting questions of where the story is actually happening. For some authors, the setting is important. William Faulkner, almost all his stories and novels take place in one county in Mississippi, and Jefferson's the county seat. So all his stuff, it's very important for him to be in the South in this one particular town so he can examine everything that's going on in there. Flannery O'Connor talks about the importance of being a Southern writer. And having her stories being geared towards Southern characters and the Southern audience. So some of you getting into some of her stuff, I might end up reading some of her views on that. But setting can be very important. You're going to see it's very important to the realist as well. I want to put real people in real situations and real places. Style is just kind of a catch-all phrase. That's what makes Flannery O'Connor. Generally, if you've read enough of her, you can recognize one of her short stories if you just open it to the middle of it. And you just see her humor, her choice of words. If you read a Poe short story, you get these long, complex sentences. They'll spend an entire paragraph telling you what some curtains look like. That's just how Poe works. This also kind of signifies some of the romantic ideas about the importance of symbolism of the curtains and things like that. But what makes Poe? It's fun to read Poe. You feel like you're in on the joke as a reader, and you see he seems to have a lot of fun writing these short stories. Other writers might develop different kind of stylistic quirks or tics that kind of make you recognize that particular writer at work. But hopefully that kind of helps. Not the most fascinating way to deliver material. It's kind of the bucket theory of education, just kind of dumping this in your brains. But again, you want to use 5 of those terms within your essay and use them properly. Again, you don't have to define them, just use them properly. And hopefully that helps a little bit. If you're just talking about the main character, use the word protagonist, right? You don't have to work too hard with this. But we'll stop there. If you have questions, be sure and let me know. And we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.